Hello everyone, this is StrawberryShorty here with my review of the Great Ace Attorney Chronicles, Resolve. I'm once again playing on the Switch Lite, and this will be a review of the second half of the collection, which is of course the second game. So there's not a lot to say right off. This is a continuation of the first game, and the gameplay is exactly the same. There are no noteworthy changes, and thus not a lot to say before we get into spoilers. I do want to bring up something I mentioned in my review of the first game, which is that examining items in the same locations in different chapters will often result in many repeated interactions. While a problem in both games, it was way more noticeable in this one. Some locations, like Sholm's Suite and the office, are in nearly every chapter, and the sheer amount of repeated dialogue is maddening. Since there's not a lot to say, I'll talk a bit about the extras here. The alternate costumes weren't really to my taste, and they can actually mess up certain plot points. I was a bit bored by the little mini-trials, but they weren't terrible. The best thing in the extras to me was the art book content, which includes notes from the artist and just lots of interesting details. I did enjoy this game more than the first one, and I'm glad that the release we got contained both titles in one. This is probably something I should have mentioned in my review of the first game, but there was a lot left unanswered by the end of it. It probably would have been frustrating waiting for the sequel to be released to have those mysteries solved. Despite liking this game more, though, I did still find it rather underwhelming. It's hard to explain without going into spoilers, so let's just dive right into them. So Case 1 sees us playing as Susato, who really does make quite a dashing gentleman. I also really like her friend Ray. The victim this time is Giselle Brett, the murderer from the first case of the previous game. This felt like a really underwhelming way to get rid of her character, and makes you wonder why they bothered constantly hiding so much of her appearance. The case also suffers from the same issue as the one she debuted in. The killer successfully poisons Brett, then goes out of their way to frame someone out of fear the crime will be linked to them. This is because of the poison they stole and its noticeable side effects. But even if there were only a few people who were thought to have been able to steal it, there'd be no way to tell that this person specifically was the killer. Like, risking both stabbing the victim and framing Ray were just both unnecessary. This is also one of the cases where my years of Ace Attorney experience really came back to bite me. The pen and the article about the stolen poison are in our evidence pretty much right from the start, and I immediately figured out that the killer had put poison in the pen and that the poison was the real cause of death. Even the killer is obvious, as our two witnesses are returning characters who don't feel like believable culprits. One of the returning characters is Hosonaga, who is tragically underused, and Soseki is the other, and he has become even more unlikable. There's this totally not important photographer in the background whenever Soseki is testifying, taking pictures, so of course I figure out that he's the killer. His breakdown involves a cool scene of Ray and Susato taking him down, and we even get to see the judge, who knew of Susato's true identity the whole time, kicking some butt. So, Case 2 has even more of Soseki, and connects heavily to the first one where we defended him. Almost immediately after being acquitted, he's accused of a crime yet again, though his alleged victim turns out to not be quite dead. The scene where Shamspear sits up is genuinely freaky. Olive, the barely mentioned victim from Soseki's case in the last game, plays a bigger part here, with both her and Shamspear being exposed as would-be killers. There's this whole gas conspiracy, with one of the jurors being pretty relevant to the whole thing. It doesn't work well for me, possibly because I live in modern times. The idea that blowing on a pipe could flood a building with gas just seems so insane. It also seems ridiculous that the way we force Shamspear to confess is by getting the loot before him. Like, why would that make him confess to murder and attempted murder? And why is it that a criminal couldn't just break into the apartment where the treasure was hidden? Or strike a deal with the tenant, even if he ultimately betrayed said deal? And he was friends with Soseki, but he couldn't get into the apartment, drug him, and then get the treasure? And why does no one point out how Olive's chosen method of murder could have easily killed the gas man? Another thing I dislike about this case is how Ryunosuke freaks out upon learning who the prosecutor is going to be. I know this is supposed to be just after the fourth case of the previous game, at which point he hardly knows Van Zieks, but he acts like the man is some monster. This is also why I wish he'd seen McGilded die, because it seems so weird how he keeps panicking over the Reaper stuff despite never really experiencing it firsthand. Also, side note here, but when pushed to identify who tried to kill Shamspear, did anyone else pick Garadeb? Completely forgetting he chronologically appears on the jury after this, because I know I did. So case 3 is probably my favorite case in this game, and one of the only ones I really like at all. It's nice getting to interact more with Van Zieks, and a lot of crazy stuff happens. There's also this article about Van Zieks and his masked apprentice fighting off assailants, and for some reason we don't get an anime sequence of this. The masked apprentice is obviously Kazuma, but at least the other characters figure it out pretty much right away. It could have been a good twist, but like I said in my last review, I immediately thought Kazuma wasn't really dead. His death needed to be done better, and his return probably should have been less obvious. That said, the rest of the case is interesting, and Enoch Drebber is my favorite character in the entire game. Did anyone else think his wax model was actually his corpse, though? And, like, that's why no one could find him? Because that's what I thought, especially with the look on its face. I was also super interested in Martha. She's so weird. In this case, had one of the hardest things to figure out, which was pointing out the issue with the claim that the victim was killed while lying down. I literally got this one completely by accident. The real issue I have with this case, though, only real issue I have with it, is why Courtney felt the need to go along with the would-be killer. There's no reason to believe that they actually know anything, least of all anything they can prove, and Drebber had already told his story with no one believing it years ago, so, like, what's she worried about? Case 4, this case got really interesting right before it ended. I loathe when cases get split in two. The redheads were interesting from the start, while I wish we'd gotten more info about the street urchins. It feels like the problem of kids being homeless really needed to be addressed more for how often they bring it up. And poor Beppo. I hate being cold, so I really sympathize with him. Then again, it wasn't nice that he was overcharging people in the last game, so... Also, Gregson is killed off this time around. I didn't really have any attachment to him, and like with Kazuma, his death was handled in such a way that I didn't believe it at all. I actually think things might have been better if he'd suddenly showed up and done something at the trial. Speaking of the trial, Strongheart is the judge now, and the whole jury mechanic just gets thrown out the window, which is kind of weird. I definitely thought at that time that, like, if Strongheart is the main villain, it's gonna be hard to take him down in these circumstances. Oh, and Van Zieks is the defendant, and Kazuma is the prosecutor. We get the shocking reveal that Susato's father is actually Shulm's partner, but not Iris's father, making me start to wonder if we're ever even going to find out who it is in this game. We never do find out the whole thing about Martha and why her last name is different from her mother's. Like, they draw attention to it, but it's never explained. I figure out at this point that Judge Jigoku, the Japanese trial judge, is Gregson's killer, in part because, like, the minute this case started, I zeroed in on that whole thing about his trunk not needing to be searched because of his position, and then I had checked out the ticket. And, like, as an Ace Attorney fan, the minute you hear, oh, it's so lucky your luggage didn't need to get searched because you're a minister, and it's like, that sounds like something that's going to be relevant in the trial later. Yeah, and when they mentioned the whole grouse thing, and I remember we saw the ticket in our inventory, I rushed to check it, and it was like, oh, it does say grouse. And it also said the France thing, and Gregson was in France when he was killed or whatever. Also, I had two other, like, really random theories brought about by my many years playing Ace Attorney. The first was that the Asogi papers were probably hidden in that sword, Karuma. And the other was, they kept talking about how Van Ziek's brother Clint being a victim of the professor made no sense because he was such a good guy, and it's like, so that probably means he's not a good guy. So he's probably the professor. And I was, like, getting really excited thinking about where Case 5 could go if this was just Case 4, but then the case ended. So I go into Case 5 pretty sure I know who the killer is and suspecting all this other stuff. And that's disappointing. Case 5 does eventually confirm all three of my theories, which again makes the reveal a little underwhelming. The case does have a lot of great moments for both Kazuma and Van Zieks, and Shulms pulls off a really cool trick. But it's hard not to be a little disappointed that I basically figured everything out. Also, the big evil bad guy behind everything, to no one's surprise, was Strongheart. The only actual twist that came as a surprise was the reveal that Clint Van Zieks is Iris's father. But even that's just told to us as an afterthought. It didn't really mean much of anything. It would have been nice to see her and her uncle, Van Zieks, interact more, but hearing her call Shulm's daddy was sweet. Kazuma stays in England, and despite all his happy talk of having a wonderful family there, Ryunosuke decides to return to Japan together with Susato. Makes me wonder if there was a third game planned. I will add here, really random, but I loved the credits sequence for both games. Anyway, I definitely liked this game more than the first, but still found it underwhelming. Lots of enjoyable characters, just like the first game, but the overall story just didn't really do anything for me. I'm not sure what else to say because it's honestly hard to explain what my issue with these games is. What did you think? Did you like this game? Was it better or worse than the first? Please let me know in the comments. In the meantime, thanks so much for watching. Bye!